The format for this evening is to have an initial reflection of around 10 minutes from Nino. Then we will have some sharing from young people on activities undertaken in United World Week back in May. After that, we have Lorna Gold, chair of the Global Catholic Climate Movement, try saying that in a hurry, and director of movement building at Faith Invest. So we'll find out more about that in Lorna's speech. At 8:20, we will have breakout rooms so that smaller groups can discuss anything that has come up so far and take the opportunity to speak as well as listen. Hopefully everybody will join in. We have gently prepared a few people to help facilitate groups, but hopefully there'll be no shortage of things to share. Then at 8:35, we come back together and there's an opportunity for questions to our speakers. Please put those questions in the chat and the meeting host will draw attention to questions raised. Please be patient because obviously we have a good number on this call and we'll get through as many questions as we can. But I suspect we probably won't have time for all of them. At 8:55, we will draw to a close and set out a brief outline of the two further events that we have set up later in July. And we'll end with a song performance from the Gen Verdi Performing Arts Group. So I hope this will be an interesting and informative time together, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome our first speaker in Nino Pelusi, who has been part of the Central Focolare Eco1 Commission and who may be known to quite a few of us from his time in London a few years ago. So hello and great to see you, Nino. Over to you.
Hello, David, thank you. And good evening, everyone. It's a real joy to be back among friends. A special welcome to the sisters and brothers from the Islamic Unity Society. There are so many memories and treasured fond memories of our time together, especially doing environmental work in London with the tree planting. The environmental crisis is undoubtedly one of the most urgent and critical problems of our times. And now more than ever, we need to stand together, people of faith, to protect what Pope Francis calls our common home. A high time for acting together, to think together, and to pray together. I'm sure we're all very familiar with the work of Pope Francis and Laudato Si, so I will leave that to go into detail with Lorna. With my short introduction, I'd like to focus rather on the link between religions and environmental work. Perhaps not many people know that around the time Laudato Si was released, we have seen similar publications on the environment from Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, and notably from the Islamic community with the Islamic Declaration on Climate Change, which was released a few months after Laudato Si in Istanbul. But why, let me start sharing my screen. All right, can you see it? Yeah. But why should we, people of faith, care about the environment? Although our immediate perception of ecology is that of a problem of industrialized societies, ecology could in fact be seen rather through a religious lens. And this not only because religions must have a word to say in the face of a crisis which is touching upon the lives of millions of people throughout the world, millions of believers, but rather we might argue, some people have argued, because our perception, our interpretation of our relationship with nature is rooted somehow in our religious traditions, in our holy books. So this evening we'll try with this short reflection to go back at some key ideas that could help us motivate and navigate our commitment from a spiritual angle. We start with the radical new idea that the universe is created freely by a God who is love, a God who remains present in creation, and yet at the same time is distinct from it. Creation is sacred, because it's linked to God. And since the Middle Ages, that relationship between human beings and nature was fundamentally governed by natural laws and characterized by collaboration. Monasticism, especially in the West, was, for instance, so profoundly aware of that spatial relationship to preserve the most beautiful forests in Europe that in many cases have become UNESCO World Heritage. St. Francis's life is an extraordinary testimony of such relationship. In his Canticle of the Creatures, he calls the sun and the moon and the waters and the stars sisters and brothers. With this, is not just expressing something very emotional about nature, but rather affirming a profound truth. He perceives, he senses that unity permeates the whole cosmos, the whole universe. Again, in the Franciscan sources, we find that Francis asks that part of the friary garden always be left untouched, so that the wild flowers and the herbs could grow there, and those who saw them could raise their mind to God, the creator of such beauty. Again, in Francis' intuition, we can see more than just a poetic sensitivity, but rather a profound attention in preserving biodiversity. In the West, up until this point in human history, humans perceive themselves in a world mostly as a sacred and mystical reality, larger than one's mind, even larger than what one's mind was capable of grasping. It's only with the advent of the Enlightenment that we assist to the progressive deterioration of that vision of the world. In that separation, in that rupture of the enchantment between a thinking human being and the rest of nature, there perhaps lies the first sign of the ecological crisis. However, humanity has preserved that holistic vision of its place in the cosmos in the religious and mystical experience. We find many instances in all religions, in Christianity as well as in Islam. Chiara Lubich, to start with an example, perceived the presence of God in nature in a web of loving relationships. In a mystical experience in 1949, she writes, and I quote, "What appears to be distinct and separated, a flower, the sky, the sun and the moon, the sea or a puddle, the mystics saw unified by a loving light governing everything, as if all of creation were one song of love, as if the stones and the snow, the flowers and stars were so united in their essence with that light and with one another that they seemed to have been created as gifts for one another, being one in love with all the others." Christian liturgy, especially in the East, has played a major role in keeping together the spiritual and the natural. During our liturgical celebrations, we continually include material elements in our individual and communitarian prayer life, starting with the bread and the wine, which come from the material world in the Eucharist. Liturgy tends to involve all our senses. The eyes through the beautiful icons, images, and the liturgical paraments, our sense of hearing through the hymns and songs, our sense of smell through the incense. But let's go to Islam. Of course, I'm not an expert, but I've been passionate about Islam, and I've been dipping my toes in the waters of Islamic spirituality during my time in Istanbul, especially. In Islam, the vision of nature is rooted in the Quran. We find that God is primarily, as much as in Christianity, the God of creation. The Ramadan itself, which memorializes the descent of the Holy Quran upon the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is based on the lunar phases, which is a natural phenomenon, and therefore on the lunar calendar. We find in the Quran that nature is cited 750 times, and 16 of the 114 surahs are dedicated to animals, and natural phenomena. In Islam, and our friends from the Islamic Unity Society know that very well, planting a tree is particularly encouraged to the point that it's considered an act of worship. In a famous hadith, we find that if resurrection is starting and one of you has a sapling in his hand, which he can plant, before he stands up, he must do so. And now here I report a photo from our time in London, planting trees with the Islamic Unity Society. It was a fantastic time together. In another hadith, we discover that animals enjoy rights for which human beings are held accountable. Whoever kills a sparrow without any reason will be questioned by God on the day of judgment. A very powerful trait of Islamic spirituality holds that the whole of creation, the whole universe, could be considered Muslim. And with that, we refer to its etymological root, Islam, that I'm told could translate with to be surrendered to God, to be abandoned to God, to be abandoned to God and to his rules. The point here of this intuition is that God sustains creation in its unity. In other words, nature is saved because by obeying to the rules of nature, which are the rules of chemistry, biology, and physics, he obeys to the will of God. He does the will of God. And it's a very similar intuition to what Chiara also had in 1949, when she says the whole of creation lives the gospel. In a sense, it's a similar way of putting it. But how about human beings? Similar to Christianity, in Islam, human beings are fundamentally God's vicars on earth, stewardships, a position of stewardship, what in Islam is called Khalifa. I like to report among the many possible passages, a verse from Surah number 2, which is perhaps the most ecological of the surahs. In verse number 30, we find a beautiful picture of the project that God has in mind for the relationship between humans and nature. Here is a dialogue between God the Creator and the angels at the moment of creation. Let's read it together. When your Lord said to the angels, I'm placing a successor on earth, they, the angels, replied, will you place in it someone who will cause corruption in it and shed blood, while we declare your praises and sanctify you? And God replies, I know what you do not know. What I find very beautiful in this passage is not simply that God puts humans above the angels, but rather that God is expressing optimism towards our capacity to know, protect, preserve, and manage its resources. Going towards the end now, what I feel emerges very strongly from this theme of nature as we look through our religious traditions is that nature carries a spiritual significance, or if you want, at least a metaphysical significance. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis underlines this concept by quoting the poet and mystic Ali Al-Khawaz. If you are not familiar with this passage, I will encourage you to go back to Laudato Si in paragraph 233 and read the note. This is the first time in the history of the church that we find an explicit reference to a Muslim author in an encyclical letter, an official document of the Catholic Church. The point here is that the Pope is emphasizing that we need not to put too much distance between the creatures of the world and our interior experience of God. If you want, this is the opposite image of what we saw of the human beings of the Enlightenment being completely separated by nature. Here, the Pope is inviting us, and I think the Spirit is inviting us all to go back to that holistic vision in which we belong to the natural world as much as everything else. In this perspective, we can perceive primarily nature as a gift. And the first purpose of the gift is not that of being consumed, but rather that of creating a bond or a relationship. Therefore, the purpose of nature is that of being a bridge between us, human beings, and God. Today, all our hopes on the environment seem to be focused solely on science and technology. That's clearly very important. However, science and technology by themselves cannot solve the ecological problem. And I'm saying that also as a professional scientist myself. It's clear that we need wisdom to help us decide the path onto which we want to walk as humanity. I'm convinced that the vision of nature that is embedded in our religious traditions and is so very beautifully portrayed in Laudato Si is a call for responsibility to think together and to act together, as you put on your flyer. With this, I'd like to close this moment of reflection by quoting a great champion of spiritual environmentalism, if you want, His All Holiness Patriarch Bartolomeo of Constantinople, whose words I'm sure will inspire us all this evening. It's not too late. God's world has incredible healing powers. Within a single generation, we could steer the earth towards our children's future. Let that generation start now, because now is the kairos, the decisive moment in human history, when we can truly make a difference. Because now is the kairos, when the consciousness of the world is rising to the challenge. Because now is the kairos, for us to save the soul of our planet. Because now is the kairos, there is no other day than this day, this time, this moment. Indeed, let it start now. May God bless all of us to bring our labor to fruition. Thank you.
Well, can I say firstly, thank you, Nino, given us a lot to think on and reflect. I think we'd all like to see and share some of that, which hopefully you'll be able to share, that we can share more widely. And it leads us, I think, very well to our next part of the program this evening. So I welcome the young people who are going to share a little from the United World Week, and particularly the Islamic Unity Society and the work that they've been involved with. So I think, Amen, welcome. And Plinio.
Yes. Also, Eleanor is with us. Yes, she. Thank you, David. Thank you, Nino. Yes, we are the young people, but not only. Firstly, we would like to start introducing ourselves. I'm Plinio. I'm Brazilian, and currently I live in the Focolare community in London.
I'm Eleanor. I'm Scottish, and I'm one of the Gen 3 in Scotland of the Focolare.
And thank you and welcome everybody. I'm Ayman Al-Douani. I'm based in Leeds and I'm the chairman of the Islamic Unity Society. I think, as you say, David, it's very well sort of prefaced in terms of Nino's talk. I found it very moving, and it was almost as if you knew exactly what he was going to say and exactly what we were going to say, and then it matched them together, because it's so aligned in terms of some of the experiences that we had as a group when we were sort of collaborating on the initiative that we started just in May. So I'm just going to share my screen, so hopefully that should start to come up on your screens as well. Effectively, I thought one of the ways to sort of tell this story was almost how the idea of this campaign sort of came together. And as Nino mentioned, the organization I'm from, the Islamic Unity Society, or IUS for short, has had a long-standing relationship with the Focolare. We've done lots of different sort of projects together in some of the different cities that we work in. And our main sort of mission, if you like, as an organization is about empowering British Muslim youth and ensuring that they can be active and sort of strong examples and the movers of shakers in society for social action. So one of the sort of things that we were thinking about when we were planning as an organization quite recently was that one of the biggest challenges that faces our whole global community is climate change. And even though we had done pockets of work, it's not an area that we'd had a dedicated work stream. And so we set up an environmental work stream last year. And one of the first places we wanted to go was to sort of unite and work with some of our interfaith partners, and in particular really rekindle the work and the relationship with the Focolare movement, which had probably, to be honest, had gone a bit quiet between both organizations. But what was amazing is that once we sort of connected, and I think I was speaking with Davide and then met Eleanor and Plinio, the chemistry of these sort of the united vision, if you like, in terms of caring for our common home, was so quick that I felt like I knew these people and I'd been working with them for a number of years. And I think that aligns to us working on a very noble cause, and B, in terms of the drive and the energy and where we source that from, and hopefully a God-centric way, and with our intentions and being pure and sincere. And I think what I loved in terms of as we were working together is through the collaboration on a particular campaign that you'll hear about shortly, was that we were learning more about each other and appreciating more about each other's circumstances and even sort of beliefs and religions. And it was actually through the month of Ramadan when we were planning a lot of it. So even sort of a lot of the members from IUS were fasting, and so we had to sort of factor that in. And I think again, it's sort of just this sort of common goal, if you like, of trying to be custodians and stewards of the earth, which is, you know, the responsibility that we've inherited and been given by God, was something that was sort of central. So I'm very glad to rekindle this partnership in terms of this initial campaign. We're really keen to make sure that it's not just a one-off event, and that it continues going forward and we work together. And hopefully this springboard, both in this event as well, continues to build up the steps of hopefully trying to make a dent in improving the way that we look after our common home. And so with that, I'll pass over to Plinio to maybe share a bit of sort of his experiences throughout the campaign and the organization.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And also for me, by the time that we started organizing this campaign, I had just arrived in London, and I had my really first contact with the IUS, and I was particularly moved by this commitment of our IUS friends, and also the openness and the attention toward others' ideas, listening always without hurry and appreciating the diversity of opinions. For example, I remember one particular meeting, we were struggling in finding a name to this campaign. And after listening carefully, our friends from iOS came out with a suggestion, Guardians of the Earth, which covered all our expectations, but also it's a name present in the Quran. And therefore, there is a special importance also for our Muslims and brothers and sisters. So this campaign was organized by the IUS, but also Al Abayt Society of Scotland and the Focolare movement. We used the United World Week as our springboard to launch a campaign to raise the awareness about the climate change. So our aim was to empower individuals and all together in the world to take actions and to preserve our environment. So this you can see, now you can see also our slogan, small changes to make a big difference. We also created a hashtag to interact and to link all the social media that we created during this event. And now I pass to Eleanor.
Hello. Okay, so as you can see, this is kind of the practical bit of it, but we decided to create these infographics and to share them on two very main social medias, on Facebook and on Instagram, which allowed us to make connections with people who had little to no connection with any of the organisations involved, as well as our own communities. We wanted this project to be really relevant to everybody, from really small families to really large families with lots of small children, to people living on their own as well. And we wanted to make sure that everyone was able to get involved in the run up to COP26 and to the Dare to Care initiative that was running that week as well. So we decided to go with this 3-step kind of format you can see here, which is the focus, the inform, and the take action. So the information bit gives clear and very understandable, if very shocking, facts about climate change, or about whatever the focus was, in order to educate our audience and to spread awareness as well. And our action points gave very simple, everyday examples of things that people could be doing in their houses, because a lot of people were in lockdown and in isolation at this point. Things that everyone could change in their daily lives, like taking public transport if they could, shopping in charity shops, fixing leaky taps. So things that anyone can do, everyone and anyone, in order to make it relevant to everybody. So these small concrete actions allowed everybody to make very small changes, but when done together, it makes a big difference, hence the name of our campaign. So here you can see it was run over the United World Week. So we had our 7 days of action points. So here you can just see our different focuses that we decided on. We had quite a lot of choices. We had a massive Google document of all these focuses that we wanted to choose. But we decided that these would be the most relevant to everybody and allow everybody to be involved. So you can see there we have water conservation, energy conservation, sustainable diets, clean transport, reduce, reuse, recycle, gardening, and conscious consumerism. And a lot of these things were also things that people maybe weren't as informed as they thought they were on. I find myself learning quite a lot through that as well. So if we go on to the next slide, this is some of the feedback you can see of the people we reached. A lot of this, you'll recognise some of the names. Each post reached up to 863 people, I think was our maximum, on Facebook alone, and went a lot further than that as well. And many people, as you can see here, suggested ideas which we hadn't thought of and inspired others as well. It was really lovely to see that community build. And so it didn't allow us, it allowed us to not only have a collective environmental impact, but also to have this kind of emotional connection between people all around the globe, which I think Felinio is going to talk about.
Yeah, what surprised me was receiving the feedback from our friends and from people who never had contact with the folklore movement or IOF, for example. One of my friends from Germany, after receiving our calendar, he sent me a message saying, I'm open, and today I commit myself to prepare a health diet for the children who I look after. Like this small but significant activities, and there were so many. Another community in Asia, from the folklore community in Asia, after receiving the calendar, they asked to use our program in one of the ecological camps during the holidays, where the participants will reflect and put into practice all the themes for each day, all together. So this is just to illustrate some of our fruits of this campaign, and it's still going on because it's still receiving feedbacks and people who want to take these actions even after the United World Week. So, amen. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, guys. As in, not much more to add, but I think, as I say, the idea of this being a continued effort, both from us and hopefully like a drop in the ocean in terms of a ripple effect that could have, You can see here just some of the social media ways in terms of interacting with the campaign. But I do hope that both yourselves and maybe sort of your networks in terms of if you can engage other people and sort of spread the word. But I look forward to the continued work together of both Focolare and Islamic Unity Society. And just wanted to sort of take the opportunity to thank you all both for listening, Nino for his beautiful talk, and then also the organisers for inviting us and being able to sort of share this very worthy cause with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Oh, that's great. Thank you very much indeed, Eamon and Plinio and Eleanor. I think it's really brought to life some of those sort of practical things that we can all do and we can all share and we can all do collectively. And I think that leads us very well onto our next speaker. So I would love to welcome now Lorna Gold. Over to you, Lorna.
Hi, David. Hi, everybody. It's so lovely to be here with you all this evening. I'm actually not in Ireland tonight. I'm in Bath in England, so not too far away from quite a few of you. It's just so inspiring to hear those stories. And when you hear what I've got to say now, you'd think we'd planned it. So I'm going to read what I've prepared just for the sake of helping Angela with the translations. So it'll probably be more a reflection on the COP and where we're at with all of that. So I'm going to start. None of us can deny that the times that we are living in today are truly extraordinary. The past couple of years have really turned all our lives upside down. And I'm sure among us all this evening, there are people who have lost loved ones due to COVID, people who've got really seriously sick or know others who got seriously sick, others who have seen their hopes and dreams put on hold or even killed off altogether. All of us have seen our lives disrupted in fairly major ways. And we know, sadly, that the nightmare of this pandemic is not over, not by a long shot. Hopefully, we know that there's light again at the end of the tunnel due to the wonders of science, vaccinations. Yet there is no doubt that the story has a long way to run, not least because of the deep inequalities in our world. That means that only a tiny fraction of people have been vaccinated, and we'll have a hope of getting vaccinated within the near future. And we know that so long as this virus affects some people somewhere on this planet, it affects all of us. Why, you might ask, am I talking about the pandemic? Did you come to the wrong webinar? Thought this was meant to be about climate change. I have to talk about the pandemic because it's hugely relevant to the issue of climate change, and particularly the climate negotiations that are happening in Glasgow this year. The pandemic, to put it bluntly, has reminded us in a very profound way that we cannot be well. We cannot have a well planet, and we cannot be well on a sick planet. The backdrop, or you could even say the foreground of pandemic politics, is actually the context in which we're all living and breathing today. And it affects so many aspects of the climate politics. It affects how we can meet together, who can travel and who cannot travel, how many resources are available, the energy levels that people have to focus on environmental issues. And the pandemic is happening in a world which is so divided already with international relations. It is risking deepening these even further in the face of a global crisis of climate change and ecological breakdown. Like the virus itself, pandemic politics is affecting climate change in ways, or climate action in ways we do not fully understand. For example, one of the big questions that's being asked right now is to what extent the anger and the sense of betrayal over countries, poor countries not having access to vaccines, is going to impact on the ability and the willingness to reach compromises and fruitful conclusions at the COP in Glasgow. So you can see that how the pandemic is being managed, and particularly the issue of universal access to vaccines, is one of the keys to a positive outcome in Glasgow. Looking at it like this, you could say this pandemic came at the very worst moment for humanity. Just as we were somehow, as Patriarch Bartholomew kind of prophetically said in 2009, but it's happened since, we were slowly waking up to the climate crisis, thanks to the hard work and the prominent campaigns, in particular of groups like the climate strikers, like Greta Thunberg. But the pandemic seems to have acted as a massive distraction. The pandemic, in fact, hit right as those protests were at their very peak. The message of the scientists, which was taken up so well by the climate strikers, was pretty stark and dire. I probably don't need to remind you, but perhaps it's worth remembering that scientists have told us, climate scientists, that we actually have 10 years to change direction radically in reducing our climate emissions, or face catastrophic and irreversible change to our ecosystems. So those 10 years ago were 2 years ago, they said that. So we actually are 8 years now, not from the end of the world, as some people might get the wrong end. It's not the end of the world, but it's 10 years to make the reductions in emissions that will enable the future generations to have a livable future. Why is that window so important? It's very important because it takes time. You can't magic up renewable power stations. They need to be constructed. You can't magic up changes in policies. They need to be passed in Parliament. They need to be, all these things take actual time. Climate emergencies were declared in many countries in 2018 and 19. Major institutions such as faith groups, including the Focolare movement, began to get out of fossil fuels. Renewable energy technologies had started to go mainstream. And it's interesting to just reflect where we might be now preparing for Glasgow if the pandemic had not hit. Yet the pandemic is here, and we're here, and we're living in what seems like a very different world. Whilst for many, some see the pandemic as only negative, I kind of see things quite differently. There's no denying that the pandemic is a nightmare, and that's where I started. With the exception of perhaps a major war, it's a crisis of epochal-changing proportions. And since we're right in the middle of it, it's hard to say what the long-term impacts are. Yet the pandemic has taught us important lessons and continues to teach us these lessons about ourselves that we had perhaps ignored for far too long. Pope Francis, in his wonderful book, Let Us Dream, which kind of, to me, is like part 2 of Laudato Si. It's like he reflects on the pandemic itself. He says that you cannot come out of a crisis the same as the way you went into it. The nature of crisis is change. The pandemic is a crisis, and therefore none of us will come out the other end the way we went in. And because the crisis is global, it has the potential to change us all. It's a shared experience. What the Pope says is that whilst we know that change is inevitable, we don't exactly know how we will be changed. And there's where we have choices. We can choose how we respond to the crisis we're in. We can react with fear, anger, selfishness, or we can choose to respond with solidarity, compassion, and love. In other words, the crisis, again, as Patriarch Bartholomew said, is also a potential kairos, an opportune moment for positive change if we make an effort, if we choose and we allow it to become it. For those who are a bit more skeptical, this could seem like wishful thinking. But just think about the major crises in world history. The Second World War, the most awful tragedy. Out of it came the United Nations and the major global institutions, international law, human rights, the welfare state, the NHS. Whilst by no means perfect, out of crisis came an era defined by international cooperation and a rallying cry, never again. It seems that history, like individual human lives, is built on cycles of tragedy, rebirth, dying, reimagining. Arundhati Roy, the Indian author, speaks of our pandemic as a portal, because everything is shaken to its core. The pandemic becomes a time to see things differently and to choose which aspects of society we can shake off and which we're going to carry into the future. We have each experienced this in our own lives. And somehow, through the absence of connection, we're discovering that connection to each other and to nature is so fundamental to who we are as human beings. And it doesn't stop there. The pandemic is teaching us other important lessons, critical to tackling the climate change crisis. Is perhaps what has been missing. In particular, it has taught us what acting together in the face of a common threat means. Greta Thunberg and the climate strikers called for the world to treat the emergency of the climate crisis like an emergency, because the scientists tell us we're running out of time. And if we don't act, we'll render large parts of the world uninhabitable for that generation. But whilst governments declared emergencies, so-called emergencies, nothing changed in 2019. And the strikers accused the world of procrastinating and declaring emergencies in words only. And if you think about it now, having experienced lockdowns, having experienced everything we've experienced through the eyes of the pandemic, you can start to understand what acting in an emergency situation actually looks like. What it means to actually take collective action. Before the pandemic, human society had largely forgotten what it means to act collectively in a crisis. We'd become completely sold, or largely sold, on the idea that it's enough for us to follow the market values, in a politics and an economics based on market values, in order to tackle the climate crisis. We devalued the potential that we have when we act together for the common good, and we make a decision to do so. I actually think we didn't believe we could do this, that we could solve this. The pandemic, however, with all the flawed responses and imperfections, and we know many, many of those, has taught us a huge lesson. We can bend curves. Because the biggest curve that we need to bend together is the one of our climate emissions. If we can bend the curve of the pandemic, the young people taking real sacrifices to protect the older generation, then surely the response in the next years that come, the older generations, because it's primarily the older generations, can make sacrifices in order to bend the curve of emissions to protect the future generations. And now we're all hankering to get back to normal. And God knows we want to get back to normal, some kind of normal. But there's a real sense within us that that new normal has to be different. It can be normal, but let's strive to, as Arundhati says, to throw away, to let go of our unsustainable ways as we move towards that new normal. The change now is to create a normal which breaks the cycles of environmental destruction and points to a clear pathway towards a better future. We know this is no easy task, but we know the solutions exist. What's astonishing when you saw those slides that Eleanor and the others presented there, there's no shortage. They said they filled a full hard drive with the solutions that they came up with. We do know the solutions are there, big and small. We need to build the political will at all levels, the institutional will, to ensure that those individual actions also translate into political pressure and change for future generations. So what can we do to shift the dial? How can we ensure the crisis becomes a kairos? On a practical level, to me, it's about making plans, action plans. It's no longer enough for us to say we're taking individual actions. And that's not to say it's not important, because all plans are made up of those actions. But let's make a plan on how we're going to change as a community, as communities which share a purpose. I'm currently leading an initiative since last year, which is all about getting faith communities of all shapes and sizes to commit to making 8 to 10 year environmental plans. Faith communities, as Nino referenced, comprise a very large swathe of the world's population, maybe not in Western Europe so much, but the rest of the world, if we remember that exists out there. In fact, 80% of people adhere to a faith. And those faiths all have very strong roots in environmental ethics, let's say. We need to engage in a journey which can seem long and arduous to change. But as we know, every journey starts with a single step. And having good companions for the journey is really important. There are many paths we can follow to bring about an ecological conversion, which, as Pope Francis reminds us, has to be a community conversion. I want to talk about, before I finish, one example, one such initiative, and it's called the Faith Plans for People and Planet. Over the past year, a new energy has emerged across the world amongst people of different faiths. And you can feel the energy rising. Many groups have come together to see how faith communities right across the world can contribute towards addressing the climate crisis as we emerge from the pandemic. The emerging movement is a network of networks that involves people of all faiths from all corners of the world. These groups are coming together to reflect on what their faith says to them about care for the environment and living for our common home. They're going back to their ancient wisdom, reviving their traditions, and setting out plans for how they're going to reduce their emissions and support biodiversity in the coming decades. The Faith Plans for People and Planet, which has the email or the website faithplans.org, is a platform that enables all faiths communities to sign up and to be supported to produce plans which will enable them to feel part of a global movement of faiths that are taking environmental action. The programme enables faith groups of all sizes to sign up and to commit to be guided through a process that has been developed by people of faith for people of faith. They commit to concrete changes such as divesting from fossil fuels, installing solar energy, restoring ecosystems, greening pilgrimages. They also look at how they can green their festivals, whether it's Hanukkah or Christmas. They look at how their leaders can preach on sustainability, and they share all this with this large community. We are happy to say that major groups have already committed to being part of this initiative, including the Vatican, the Church of England, many major Jewish groups such as Hazon, Chinese Buddhists, and many, many other groups. The initiative is backed by the World Wildlife Fund and the UNEP Faith for Earth, Green Faith, many others. And I'm really happy to say that thanks to Nino Polisi and the hard work of many others, the Focolare movement has signed up globally to be part of the initiative and to promote the faith plans through all of our communities. Within this initiative, the Catholic part of the plans is really important, and it's the Laudato Si action platform. And in fact, one of the reasons this Faith Plans initiative exists is to ensure that the Laudato Si action platform, which we'll share the link to, reaches a much wider audience, because much of the wisdom of Laudato Si can be shared universally. And we're really confident that by the 4th of October, which is when the Pope is having his big meeting with all the faith leaders on climate change, many, many hundreds of groups will have signed up to participate in the faith plans. So in conclusion, I just want to say that whilst these are challenging times, I have never been so convinced that, so hopeful and convinced that change is happening. Faith-driven initiatives are essential to that positive change, as they're deep-rooted in ancient yet ever-new values, which can help us build on what we're learning from the pandemic. So I just encourage you to look at the Faith Plans website, see how you might get involved, and let's continue on this journey together. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Lorna. It's very positive and very inspiring to hear all the different things that are taking place and underway. So I think this is our opportunity to now break into groups, discuss a little of what we've heard, questions we want to ask, things we want to share. So you'll be invited to join breakout rooms very shortly. One thing I should say is that we do have a breakout room for Italian speakers. So if you need to confirm that, perhaps just wait rather than entering the breakout room, and you'll be guided to the right one. So I hope you all have good conversations, and we'll have about 15 minutes before we then come back together. So kick off the breakout rooms would be great. All out into the breakout rooms and back again. So thank you very much. And this part of our program is the opportunity for questions to our speakers. And James is our question moderator, and I think he'll be leading the questions and to who they are to. So over to James for posing the questions.
Thank you, David. Okay, so we've received some questions. Please do continue sending in your questions, but we've got our first question for Lorna. And this question was from Maru Mormina. So the question is, it seems to me that a lot of the proposed solutions proposed to the climate emergency are technological solutions that aim to enable humanity to reduce emissions without really reducing current standards of living. For example, switching to electric cars instead of traveling less. What do you think about the idea of degrowth as a real solution to climate change? Nice, easy question.
Nice, easy question to kick us off. I think it's absolutely essential that we consider degrowth as part of the solution to the climate crisis. Now, we don't have time to get into the whole kind of theory of what is degrowth. But the reality is that ever since the start of the Industrial Revolution, our economic theory has been based on the idea of limitless growth and the idea that there are limitless resources, physical resources that we can use in order to sustain human needs. That, of course, is not true. There's a limit to our material existence. We know that. It might seem like a kind of far-fetched idea, but the planet is round. The planet isn't infinite in itself. And Earth scientists tell us that there are 9 critical limits to the Earth's systems, and that each of those critical limits, such as the ozone in the atmosphere, such as carbon emissions, all of these critical systems have tipping points, and each of them are it's very complex, they intersect. So we need to create, quite literally, or adopt. The models are there, the theories are there. One I would highly recommend is from an academic called Kate Raworth, who has come up with this idea of donut economics. And basically the idea is that we need to reframe our values to enable us to build an economic system which respects the limits of the Earth. So the donut is, on the outside is the critical systems of the Earth. On the inside is the social floor and the livable space. It looks like a donut when you look at it. You could look it up, donut economics. Why is that so important? Because we're living in a world that's very unequal. So we have this kind of balancing act. We have to come within the planetary limits of the Earth on the one hand, but we have to raise the social floor of those who don't have enough to live. Of course, we know there are ways to do that. There are kinds of social policies that can be put out, can be developed in order to do that, such as universal basic income that can lift the social floor. We can put taxes, as they're doing now. Unfortunately, the country I live in, Ireland, has not signed up to the new global compact on international tax on corporations. If you tax international corporations, you create new streams of money, and you do it in a way that is connected to their climate emissions. So the solutions are there, and degrowth is quite in some ways, it's a radical idea. It means that we stop focusing on growth, economic growth, which is the turnover of money in our economy as our kind of guides to how well we are. And we've come up with something that's a little bit more complex, in that well-being, economic well-being, or human well-being, planetary well-being should be our gauge of how well we're doing as a society. So yeah, it's a complex question, but definitely we're at a point, and the pandemic's opened the window to talk about what seem to be radical ideas of shifts in economic thinking that need to happen.
Thank you, Lorna. And there's another good question here, which is from Eddie Duncan. And this is, what's the balance of change needed between industrial change of major countries and individual changes we often speak about? He says, often individual change is important, but without major industry and governmental change, it won't be enough. So how do we manage to overcome the culture of greed of big economies to make this change?
Yeah, very good question from Professor Duncan there. I would say it's not an either or. We need everything, all. So if you think about the climate or the COVID crisis, it required each of us to wear our masks, to social distance, to do all the things that we need to do. But it also required governments to take those big actions that enable us to actually still continue kind of functioning and living. When you think about the climate crisis, we all need to do the individual actions. So all the ones that were talked about earlier. And we also need to be campaigning, advocating, talking to our MPs, doing all the things that we can do in democracies that many people can't do. We can do them because we live in free democracies, to get our join the groups that are already out there to highlight these issues and put pressure on governments to let them know we really care. This is a matter for us and we really care. But what I would say is that there's a third element. It's not just individual, it's not just government. What's emerging so important at the moment is those institutions that are the fabric of society. So I was talking about collective action. So what can the Focolari in the UK, for example, do as Focolari, as opposed to lots of individuals turning off their lights? How do you create a plan that enables the whole of, or the whole of the church, or the Catholic Church, or the Church of England, or that brings together the individual actions with the big actions? And that's where the magic, I would say, if you can call it magic, starts to happen, because you see that faith communities have such deep riches in so many different ways that we had almost forgotten, because society tends to tell religious or faith communities that somehow that message somehow seems irrelevant or something in the public discourse. And yet within those communities, there is a wealth of traditions. And Pope Francis has done this like superbly through Laudato Si, through how he preaches, through the example that he gives, and now through the Laudato Si action platform, which is a fantastic way to connect your individual actions with the communities that you are involved in. And as I said, the Faith Plans is another multi-religious initiative. So it's about thinking differently, thinking about how we can do this together, as well as individuals.
Thanks, Lorna. I think this might be the last question because of time. And it probably also leads on well to our next session, which is in a couple of weeks' time on the 15th of July. Is what 3 things do you think we might all highlight as priorities for our politicians?
Gosh, that's a very hard one to to kind of summarize. You could probably answer that better than me, James. I think the first one is around the interconnectedness of these crises. That's a really important message to get out there, to really say we need to be advocating and using our vaccines, and recognizing that the health of the planet and the health of the people are intertwined. And I should mention there's a fantastic petition set up by the Global Catholic Climate Movement, which I think is kind of unfortunately named, and I'm asking them to try and change it. It's called thecatholicpetition.org. It's almost such a bad name you might remember it. But it's actually about, it's a great petition for COP, which is about healthy planet, healthy people. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we need to find the financial resources that were promised in COP in Paris 6 years ago. The North, the rich countries promised the developing countries who are most affected $100 billion a year to tackle the effects of climate change and to bring about change, the kind of changes needed, the big changes. Virtually none of that money has materialized. So if you think the bad blood of the pandemic, there's also the bad blood of broken promises. The countries that are on their knees. We had, in our small group, we had Francis who's in Zambia, talking about the perspective from Zambia with the crisis they're facing on climate change and the crisis now with the pandemic. It really puts things in perspective. So it would be the second one. The third one, it would be really around the COP itself. I would be saying that it needs to be virtual. It needs to be fair, because those people from the poor countries can't travel. So it's really unfair if it's only the rich countries that are all vaccinated sitting around the table in Glasgow. So much as I'd love to be in Glasgow, my hometown, well, my home city, for the COP, I actually think it should be like this. It should be a virtual COP.
Thanks so much, Lorna. Thank you for your inspirational talk this evening. Thanks for all you've shared, and thanks for answering our questions so fully. And thank you also to our other speakers as well. And at this point, I'm going to hand back over to David to round us up.
Okay, thank you very much, James. I think we'd all like to, on your behalf, thank the speakers, thank Nino, thank the young people who were involved in Amen, Plinio and Catherine, and also Lorna, of course. Really, in terms of summing up, this is to sort of say that I hope this has been useful and informative for everybody. I know I found it so. As part of a small group planning, we've got 2 more events we've planned. On the 15th of July, we're going to be focusing on how you might engage with your MP, leaders, etc. And we'll have a fairly prominent politician and also a lobbying organisation, Hope for the Future, sharing some thoughts. And we have a 3rd session on the 22nd of July, which will be looking at campaigning, looking at reflection and action in our parishes and in our communities. So I do hope that people will feel inspired to join those sessions as well, and we'll share the links after this. So I think, could we perhaps give a virtual round of applause, please, for our speakers? And can I say, we'll share the links. We'll look to email out to people following this event, with many links have been referred to, so we'll pass that on to you. Yeah, sorry, 22nd of July. Yeah, it's the first session is the first one we have on the politics is the 15th of July, same time as this. The second one in relation to parishes and communities is on the 22nd of July. So please do feel free to book on for that through Eventbrite, as with this one. So I think we've all learned a lot this evening, and I'd like to finish then with our final element, which is a song, sort of, if you like, to take us out. And I wish you all the very best in your endeavours. And I think, as Lorna and all our speakers have said, we actually are stronger when we work together.
Once I spoke with an astronaut, just came back from the moon with the stars in his eyes. He said, out there I learned a lot. Something changes inside when you see the earth rise. Got no boundaries and no walls. That living, breathing ball. Love is underneath it all. Beneath the blue and green, connecting everything. I met a girl, she was very young, yet she spoke burning words with the fire in her eyes. She said, hey, something's really wrong. Deserts grow, people die while the oceans rise. She said, can't you see the urgency? You pretend that you care, then you look away. You are trampling on our hopes and dreams. We can't wait for a change, got to start today. You can feel it in the breeze.